The third argument that I used, and this is the last of the three that I used, there's two others that other people used, was the argument from perfect preservation, that the Quran has never been changed, is the argument. And now this is something that runs deep in the Islamic veins, because as a Muslim, I believe that the Bible had been corrupted. All right, the New Testament's corrupt, the Old Testament corrupt, it's all corrupt. The only thing Allah has guarded is the discernment. According to Surah 15, verse 9, Allah has guarded the Quran. This one has been unchanged. It's perfect. Once again, when we study the early Islamic sources, we find that to be false. I'll give you a few ways to look into that. First, you can look into it through the manuscript evidence. We have seen portions of certain manuscripts that have been published, for example, portions of the Yemeni manuscripts, the Sana'a manuscripts, and we find differences between that and the modern Quran. That's not my main point. You see palimpsests, such as Fogg's palimpsest, which contains within it writings from what seems like Ibn Mas'ud's Quran. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But that's been washed out and a different text has been written over it. That's not my main point either. My main point is that you look at the earliest Islamic records and you see Muslims, not just random Muslims, but the Muslims who had been entrusted with the protection of the Quran, arguing with each other over what goes into it and what does not. Where do we start seeing this? Well, we start seeing it in Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61. The entire book is a collection of how the Quran came together. In it, you see phrases like, well, I'll give you a key one first. A key one is Muhammad said, if you want to learn the Quran, go to these four men. The first person he mentions is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and then he mentions two other men, Salim and Muad, and the fourth one he mentions is Ubay ibn Ka'b. So if you want to go to the Quran, learn from these four. Two of them are Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. Okay, so Muhammad picks them as teachers of the Quran. What else does Sahih Bukhari say? Same book of Sahih Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61, says Ubay ibn Ka'b recites portions of the Quran that none of the rest of us recite. He's a teacher of the Quran. He recites portions of the Quran that none of the rest of us recite. And when asked not to, he says he will not leave it for anything whatsoever, because he heard it from the mouth of Muhammad. Surprising. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he's the first one Muhammad mentioned. You look at the records of what Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had in his Quran, he had 111 chapters of the Quran. Well, what does today's Quran have? 114. There's 3 chapters in today's Quran that were not included in the number one teacher Muhammad picked. What does Abdullah ibn Mas'ud say about those 3 chapters? He says these are Hadith Qudsi. These are revelations, sure, but they're not Quran. These are just prayers. What about the other guy, Ubay ibn Ka'b? What does he say? He says, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, you're wrong. And Uthman's Quran is wrong. It's 116 chapters. There's 2 more that should belong in here. These are the most trusted men with the teaching of the Quran, and they disagree with today's version of the Quran. The historical record points to this. The early Islamic records point to this. There's a lot more, by the way. Sahih al-Muslim actually says in hadith number 4434, I believe it is. No, I'm sorry, that's Sunan Abu Dawud. This is in Sahih al-Muslim, where it says that the reciters of Basra used to recite large sections of the Quran, but they forgot sections, out of which they remembered only this part. And they would recite portions out of large sections they had forgotten. Those are not found in the Quran today. Now, some people argue those have been abrogated. It doesn't work. For those of you who know the law of abrogation, this does not fit one of the 3 types of abrogation. It doesn't work. It's simply lost. So you have the early Muslims arguing over these things. You have records saying portions are lost. You cannot, once again, objectively conclude that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. Again, you can defend it. As a defensive position, sure, defend it all you want. And I'm not up here arguing that the theology has been changed. I'm not arguing that. I think the early Muslims did an excellent job of preserving their theology. I'm just talking about the verbatim preservation of the Quran. There's no good reason to believe that once you look at the earliest sources, unless you're coming at it from a defensive angle.